Well, thank you very much, Susan, for that very kind introduction. Yes, I am from Manchester, and I don't come up here as often as I'd like, but whenever I do, it's a very strange experience because I look up and look at the skyline, look at all the shops and the buildings changing from when I was here 25 years ago, and it never ceases to amaze me how much this city is growing in strength and culture in every single dimension. So it's always wonderful to be back. So thank you to the Society for inviting me to be here. So I'm going to talk tonight about the new wave of British national overseas migrants to the UK from Hong Kong and how that might change Britain and how it varies from other waves of migration from China and Hong Kong to the United Kingdom. But I think first it's probably worth laying out just exactly what a British national overseas or BNO migrant actually is. So before 1997, when Hong Kong was still a British colony, of course, the Hong Kong Chinese had what's known as British Dependent Territories citizenship. Now, they obviously lost this citizenship when, on the 1st of July 1997, when Hong Kong reverted to mainland Chinese control. But the Hong Kong Chinese were allowed to apply for this British National Overseas, BNO, status in the 10 years before that Chinese handover. So why might they have wanted to do this? What would be the advantage to them? Well, the BNOs could use a type of British passport and seek consular assistance and protection from UK diplomatic posts. But they couldn't come to live in the UK, very critically. The government of the UK at that stage, 1997, wasn't prepared to see the potential of migration of large numbers of Hong Kong Chinese, perhaps millions, to the UK. Now, that is what changed on the 31st of January 2021. Since then, under a new visa scheme, Hong Kong Chinese with BNO status have been eligible to come and live in the UK for 5 years, along with their families, even if those family members are not themselves BNOs. And after 5 years of residence in the UK, they will be entitled to apply for settlement, also known as indefinite leave to remain. And after 1 further year of residence, to apply for full British citizenship. So, why was there a change of heart from the UK government in allowing this to happen, in allowing this new status to be created? Well, it was created, this new system, in response to the passing of a new national security law for Hong Kong by the Beijing government, which the UK felt violated the agreements made between the UK and China at the time of the Hong Kong handover. Agreement about protecting the freedoms of Hong Kong and its people. So that's the context. So what we're going to ask tonight and talk about is, why does this wave of BNO migrants matter to the people of Britain? Oops, wrong way. Okay, so first consider the numbers. So far, since early 2021, around 160,000 BNO visas have been applied for, and most, around 135,000 of people applying for those visas, have arrived in the UK. So as you can see, it's already one of the biggest humanitarian waves of migration to the UK in the UK's history over the past 100 years, and actually throughout the entire British history. So if you look at the comparisons, it's bigger. East African Asians, when they arrived in the 1960s and 70s, about 155,000. It's already larger than that, and we know how much that migration wave has changed the UK. It's bigger than the European Jews who fled Nazi Germany from Germany and Austria in the 1930s. About 74,000. It's bigger than that. It's larger than the wave of Afghans who've fled Afghanistan more recently, and it's about level pegging with the number of Ukrainians who left after the war. So very big migration in UK historical terms. But importantly, there's actually no limit on the number of B&O migrants who could potentially come. And the UK government has estimated that there are potentially 5.4 million Hong Kong Chinese who could come under this scheme. And look how much bigger that would be than all the other humanitarian migration waves throughout the UK history. So will that many B&O Hong Kong Chinese and their families actually come? Well, it's not impossible, but it's not likely. At least the UK government doesn't think it's likely. So the UK government's central range analysis estimates that between 260 and 320,000 people are likely to come from Hong Kong to the UK under this scheme over the first 5 years. So let's take the midpoint of that, which is about 290,000, and you can see if that materialized, this would be still one of the biggest humanitarian migrations in British history, actually the biggest, bigger than all those others we saw earlier. So this is large numbers of people, very significant. And what this would mean is 290,000 Hong Kong Chinese coming would increase the existing ethnic Chinese population in England and Wales, which is around 450,000 according to the most recent census. It would basically more than halve it. More than half again. So very, very significant impact on the UK in terms of numbers, but also in terms of the UK ethnic British Chinese population. So that's the numbers. What we're going to talk about now is how does it compare, this wave, this potentially very large wave of migrants from Hong Kong to previous waves of migrants from China. So the first substantial modern wave of Chinese migration to Britain was a consequence of Britain's naval supremacy in the 19th century. So British ships needed workers to man the boilers, shoveling coal, greasing the machinery of UK ships. It was backbreaking and unpleasant work deep in the belly of ships. And what we can see here, they began recruiting from the ports of southern China, as I said, in the 19th century. And here's a photo from 1895. And you can see a Chinese crew on an East India Company ship. So these crews, like the one photographed here in an early photo, were mainly from Guangdong province in southern China. Indeed, they were actually from 4 particular areas of Guangdong. So very, very concentrated in terms of where these seamen were coming from at this time. And so these ships usually docked and stayed for a period of time in ports like Cardiff, London, and Liverpool. And when these Chinese came on shore and stayed while their ships were in dock, that was the genesis of the first Chinatowns in the UK. What we're looking at here is Chinese seamen outside a hostel in Liverpool in 1942. These seamen who came ashore quite often put down permanent roots and married British women and started families. Now, I think it's really important to recognize that these Chinese seamen who came in this way were severely exploited. They were often paid less, in fact, they were almost always paid less than the equivalent British workers who worked on these ships in exactly the same roles. And contrary to the stereotype of Chinese seamen being incredibly docile and accepting of this lower pay and conditions, actually the history shows that that when they got an opportunity, they objected to those paying conditions and went on strike when they could. The other thing I think is really important to recognize about this early wave is how atrociously these seamen were treated by the UK. So recruitment of them shot up during the First World War due to the huge increase in demand for labour, obviously a consequence of lots of workers going to the front and the ships still needing to be manned. So there's a big increase in recruitment of Chinese sailors into the merchant navy and the Royal Navy at that time. But these Chinese seamen were forcibly repatriated by the British state after the First World War ended, almost overnight. And it was a similar pattern after the Second World War. By 1945, the Chinese made up a sixth of the UK's merchant navy crews, a sixth. But more than 5,000 were again forcibly repatriated almost as soon as the war was over. And they were often forced to leave wives and children, like Yvonne Foley here. You can see her pictured with her husband Charles in 2015. So Yvonne never met her father, who she believes was a Chinese seaman originally from Shanghai, because, as we mentioned, forcibly repatriated by the British state overnight. Atrocious treatment. And there are echoes, obviously, of the more recent Windrush scandal here, which affected British Caribbean people. But I think it's arguably worse because this forcible repatriation of people like Yvonne Foley's father was unambiguously intentional by the British government, and we've got the documents to show that. So this, I think, is the context for the early wave of Chinese migrants to the UK. They were working class, they were exploited, they were ghettoized, and forcibly repatriated. Very, very important to recognize that, I think.